It was early in 2019. I was half a bottle of wine in when the video played. It described a story I had more or less heard before. As an avid consumer of political news, I had spent my fair share of time listening to podcasts, watching interviews, reading speeches, all with the hopes of understanding who would and who should be the Democratic nominee in 2020. And the story I heard was simple. It described what it's like as a child to watch your parents scrimp and scrounge to make ends meet. It described a mother in an act of defiance, pacing back and forth in her bedroom, repeating to herself, "We will not lose this house." It described that mother marching into Sears, getting a minimum wage job, saving that house, and saving her family. Again, I had heard this story before. I'd even heard the specific politician tell it. But I've been following politics long enough to have heard my fair share of affluent folks cite their parents and their struggles as proof of their own unique connection to the working class. I was cynical. I was jaded. But perhaps because I was half a bottle of wine in, I suddenly found myself beginning to cry, beginning to sob, actually. Suddenly, all at once, I realized that that story of a defiant and resilient mother refusing to back down to the pressures of the world was the story of my late mother, the story of so many mothers. And so, after months of taking other candidates much more seriously, I began to listen to that politician, Elizabeth Warren, in a different way. One attuned to the struggles our family shared across time and place, aware that for the first time in my life I was hearing a true rendition of my family's story, of its hardships, of its triumphs, brought to life by someone asking me to vote for them. At its heart, my point is simple. There are issues on which Elizabeth Warren is the most progressive or the most thoughtful in the race, in a way that is often overlooked by those who attack her in bad faith in order to score cheap political points or to prop up their own preferred candidates. So let me be clear. This video essay is the progressive case for Elizabeth Warren. It's not a case against anyone else. It's not claiming that she's perfect or that she's right on every issue. It's aware that a certain other candidate has often released plans with slightly higher expenditures, slightly and coincidentally, after her own in order to claim more progressive credentials. It respects that strategy and is aware that she's deployed it a time or two as well in this primary. This video essay is a description of why I've spent hours and hours with rapt attention watching videos of her town halls, listening to her tell the same jokes over and over again, following the twists and turns of her thinking as her language has developed and as her platform has grown over the months. I often joke to my friends that I too remember when I had a personality outside this campaign, and I'd like to explain why I've temporarily given it up. Because here's what I think most people continue to miss about Warren's campaign. Every issue she discusses, every plan she releases, begins from the same place. It starts with the lives of working people. It starts with the hardships she faced as a working mother. Why does she have the most developed universal childcare plan? Because she almost quit her job after struggling to find reliable childcare. Why does she support tuition-free technical school and 2 and 4 year degrees? Because after initially dropping out of school, she only got her degree thanks to a cheap commuter college. None of the other candidates in the field had to wait tables to pay their way through college or get through school with a baby at home, and it shows. But her campaign extends past her own experiences. She argues again and again that there is no single struggle in America. There is only a collection of fights, and we will only find liberation when we say to one another that despite our differences, we will take up each other's fights. We will stand with one another. We will support each other. That is why, from beginning to end, her plans have placed particular emphasis on righting the wrongs women and people of color have faced in an unjust economy and a rigged democracy. She understands through and through that every issue impacts different communities uniquely, which is why you have to have personalized solutions attuned to identity and individual circumstances. She is famous for her campaign's outreach to disability and trans rights activists, whose input has been incorporated across her plans. Indeed, her plans across the board link up with one another, and if you take the time to read them, rather than consuming talking points from online comments and radicalized thought leaders, you will come to recognize that they build toward an overwhelming thesis that with a bit of strategy, a ton of details, and a load of fight, we can reach toward and grasp the America which we have always imagined and which at heart we deserve. When it comes to policy, what makes her different from other candidates? She was the first candidate to propose a wealth tax. She was the first candidate to propose forcing corporations to have workers comprise at least 40% of their corporate boards. Of the candidates, she seems to have been the first to say that Black Lives Matter. She was the first candidate to promise to eliminate student loan debt under a plan that will more effectively close the racial wealth gap than simply forgiving all debt would. She is the only candidate to promise to eliminate those loans by herself without an act of Congress on day one. She is offering the largest expansion of Social Security benefits of anyone running. At $200 a month, it's nearly twice as much as the next most progressive proposal, and unlike that one, it is not means tested. She is offering the largest single investment in our public education system, $800 billion in our K-12 schools, and quadrupling Title I benefits. She is one of only a few candidates who supports tuition-free higher education. She is offering the largest investment in historically Black colleges and universities at $50 billion. She has one of the most detailed and humane disability plans of anyone in the race, and a robust labor plan based on the principle that no one should be able to exploit their workers, and that we can curb these abuses by dramatically strengthening unions. And she has immigration and criminal justice reform plans to match. She has by far the most comprehensive gun control plan of any of the major candidates. Anyone who tells you the candidates are indistinguishable here is carrying water. She is the only candidate to swear not to appoint donors to ambassadorships. She is the only candidate to create a federal agency, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which has returned billions and billions of dollars to folks taken advantage of by businesses. She is the only candidate to have a full-size climate plan for our oceans with her Blue New Deal. She is the only candidate to have been a vocal and feared critic of the Obama administration when it refused to go far enough to check Wall Street's influence. She is now the only candidate to support ending the filibuster. Budget reconciliation, which the other progressive centers, can only be used a few times per year, limiting the goals of any progressive administration that plans to rely upon it. She is the only candidate who has never waffled on integration and school busing. She is the only major candidate, yes, literally the only one, who has not sold any high-priced tickets for her time this election. She is the candidate who has most fully incorporated Jay Inslee's climate plans to get America to carbon neutral as quickly and efficiently as possible, creating tens of millions of jobs in the process. She is the candidate furthest to the left who is open to expanding the Supreme Court. She is the only candidate open to reparations for racial injustice, and the only candidate who reached out to Ta-Nehisi Coates about his famous article on the subject. She is the only candidate open to a universal basic income. She is the only candidate promising to read the names of murdered trans women of color from the Rose Garden. She is the only candidate to promise accountability to a group of marginalized people, Black women 4, who endorsed her not for her perfection, but for her willingness to listen and be held accountable. She made a similar commitment to an organization of Asian and Pacific Islander supporters. That accountability would be completely new and a huge deal. In short, when she describes big structural change, she means it. The scope of her ambitions isn't simply increased federal budgets. She is focused on an overall overhaul of our entire economic system, based in principles of fair play and equal opportunity that even moderates can get behind. Folks who complain that she described herself as a, quote, capitalist to my bones are missing the point. Her version of capitalism as she's theorized at length over the last decade, will be fundamentally different from our own, buoyed by a full-bodied social safety net and an incredibly ambitious regulatory apparatus. She understands that through intense, and I mean intense, regulation, we can force competition, in the process decentering power and spreading it across the economy. It's not for nothing that her most progressive rival urged her to run in 2016 instead of himself. And it's also not for nothing that a majority of Americans say they wouldn't vote for a socialist. She's trying to win first and worry about labels later. From a certain perspective, she uses the rhetoric of Middle America in order to pull us all further toward justice, in effect welcoming in former conservatives like herself. Indeed, when people attack her for her history as a registered Republican, they consistently overlook 2 points. First, that the last Republican presidential candidate she voted for was Ford in 1976. Second, that she changed her mind because of her research. When she entered the academy, the general consensus was that folks ended up declaring bankruptcy due to their own mistakes. She and her partners were the first to investigate empirically, by going to bankruptcy courts all across the country, why people actually go bankrupt. They discovered that most bankruptcies are due to emergencies, crises, tragedies, often caused by illness, accident, or divorce. And so, after decades of holding on to a conservative, meritocratic ideology that took the American dream at face value, when presented with the facts in full, she changed her mind. The humility of that choice cannot be overstated. It's the kind of commitment to facts and open-mindedness that a good president desperately needs. And from a certain perspective, her entire political project is trying to materialize the American dream she grew up believing in by saving capitalism from itself. Before holding elected office, she fought for decades to stop Republicans and even some Democrats, including the former frontrunner, from destroying what little protections those who need to declare bankruptcy held. She lost that fight, but she took that loss and turned it into her crusade for a consumer protection agency, and when Republicans refused to allow her to lead that agency because they were afraid of her, she took her fight to the United States Senate, becoming the only candidate currently running to defeat a Republican incumbent within my lifetime. Unlike the 2 other leading candidates, she has no history of opposing immigration or gun control, no skeletons in the closet for voting for wars in the Middle East, no wishy-washiness on Social Security. She has been consistent on these issues, along with so many others, while even other progressives have shifted with the winds. Those who prioritize consistency often do so selectively, but her central message in politics, that the game is rigged against working Americans, has been remarkably clear and consistent for decades. And when it comes to healthcare, the issue she has taken the most flack for from the left, we should be clear. She has been open to a single-payer system for decades and has only ever questioned the political expediency of enacting it all at once. Indeed, her Medicare for All plan is the only universal plan which would not directly raise the taxes of working families or middle-class folks, in part because that's a hell of a talking point. Paid for mostly by billionaires, big corporations, a financial transaction tax, increased taxation enforcement, and an employer tax in which anyone currently paying for their employees' health care will pitch in 98% of that cost to the government, her plan wouldn't increase taxes on hardly anyone, giving Democrats an incredible argument for moderates and independents that no other candidate running can match. Indeed, her plan, from a certain perspective, is the most progressive. And while some have framed her transition plan as a retreat from Medicare for All, a better interpretation would emphasize her practicality. I realize that many progressives have come to mistrust anyone who attempts to claim cred as a pragmatic. But let's get real. There is no world in which, come January 2021, Democrats have the votes for single payer all at once. That will not happen. Anyone telling you otherwise is either lying or doesn't understand how conservative the median senator, likely Sinema or Tester, will be. What we might be able to pass is a strong public option, especially if it does not raise taxes on the middle class. Warren's plan takes this into account, offering the most generous Medicare option of any candidate running. If your income is less than 200% of the poverty line, for instance, a family of 4 making under $51,000 a year, you would likely pay nothing to have your health care, your dental care, your audio care, your vision care, your addiction care, and your long-term care covered in full. Her transition plan would make these benefits free for children under 18, expand Medicaid nationwide, lower the Medicare age to 50, and allow folks on Medicare to access these benefits at no additional cost as well. Furthermore, anyone will be able to buy into her extremely generous plan, with costs capped at around 5% of one's income. Nearly 130 million Americans will be eligible to have all of their healthcare treated for free, and millions more at a cost roughly comparable to what they'd pay in taxes under the only other Medicare for All plan currently being offered. Taxes that, again, many working families would also have to pay. In terms of people's lived experience, comparing these two plans is harping on a difference without a distinction, except that even under her transition plan, you listening now would still almost certainly pay less. Though it's hard to say for sure, since she remains the only candidate with a fully costed plan whose numbers have been checked by third-party experts. Setting aside that plan would immediately be one of the most generous systems in the world, for most folks covering benefits that are left entirely uncovered in Canada, for instance, there is a strategy behind it that many have refused to recognize. If half of Americans leave the private insurance market, that will severely deduct from the capital which the insurance industry will have at their disposal in their fight against Medicare for All. It will also make clear to hundreds of millions of people, either through personal experience or through word of mouth, that receiving care without an insurance company in the way is better than any private system. The reason she aims to achieve full single payer within 3 years is partially because the 2022 midterm Senate map looks favorable to Democrats, but primarily because that extra time will diffuse, discredit, and negate the scaremongering tactics that Republicans and the moneyed interests will inevitably deploy. The reason her plan is messy, complicated, and sometimes non-intuitive is because she is the first major candidate to grapple with the full political, economic, and administrative challenges of transitioning 1/6 of the economy over the course of a presidency. What some have read in bad faith as her retreat from Medicare for All is in fact her full commitment to its ideals and to its enactment. She did not have to explain how she'd pay for it, but she did. She did not have to explain how her public option would quickly build the single payer, but she did. She took those risks and she paid a price because of her commitments, not despite them. We can't brute force our way to overhauling healthcare. We watched the Republicans try more or less the same strategy in 2019, and it simply does not work. We need a plan for what to do if we don't have the votes in 2021 for Medicare for All. Warren is simply the only candidate who offers that plan to cover as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, as fully as possible, with a canny eye toward leveraging our initial victories toward full, universal, free healthcare. Anyone telling you that that's not progressive or that she's sold out has an axe to grind and isn't being straight with you. Above and beyond these plans, there is one other feature of her candidacy that is too often overlooked by lefty critics. She understands that corruption is the reason we've struggled to move forward on the issues that stalk everyday Americans. She understands that it is corruption in our party and in our government that has stymied our progressive agenda time and again. She has proposed the largest anti-corruption and pro-democracy plan of any candidate running, which together would end lobbying as we know it, take big money out of our politics, and nationalize and protect the right to vote across the board. It's easy to deploy rhetoric of replacing our current system altogether. What's hard is to describe at the granular level what tactics and which levers of power a candidate will use to reshape the country for the better. But her experience in government has given her unique skills and insight that others lack. She has done that work at far greater length than any other candidate. Her plans are fully costed. They avoid raising middle class taxes across the board, and they center the issue that everyday voters already understand is at the heart of all our woes: corruption. Because unless we make big moves there, unless we fight smart there, then having the purest and most perfect leftist agenda will mean nothing. That's why she has over a dozen plans devoted just to anti-corruption and pro-democracy measures, together spanning hundreds and hundreds of policy changes, big and small, which would together reshape the playing field and bring government back into the hands of the people it's meant to serve. And you know what else? She's the only candidate who has offered nearly every attendee of her events a chance to share their hopes, their fears, and their lives with her, person to person. She has gotten to hear from well over 100,000 people across the course of the last year, something almost no one else in the world can claim. Folks make fun of those selfies because they understand, in a sideways way, that she is doing something unique and meaningful. Yes, they're not technically selfies, but they are a radical restructuring of a candidate's time, allowing her to incorporate suggestions made by normal people, such as her promise to have a Secretary of Education who has been a public school teacher. It is a unique and praiseworthy investment, and one that she carries forward. She remembers those stories and has vocally used them to explain why she's in this fight. Again, the scale of that is unique. We have a chance in 2020 to elect a progressive to the White House, to elect the first woman to the White House, to bring our country forward in both policy and in spirit, to choose as our leader one of the foremost experts in how government operates, as well as how it ought to operate. Her command of detail reveals a deep seriousness to the progressive mission that too many people take for granted. And her dogged determinism reveals a lifetime spent clawing her way from the ragged edge of the middle class to the center of the American political project, loudly and relentlessly demanding that we do better by one another. She understands, in a way that other candidates simply do not, that there is no single fight, that there is no single issue that unites us all. We all are already in our own personal fights which by their very nature are political. And she understands, as only someone who is surrounded by intersectional thinkers can, that we have a moral responsibility to take up each other's fights. She understands that that is in fact what government is for. She recognizes solidarity without erasing difference. She centers the identities of the marginalized at the heart of every plan. She explains how race and gender intersect to inflect every issue. She is the candidate that big money financial managers have written secret plans in fear of. She is the candidate who can finally normalize progressive ideals in everyday language that non-leftists can understand. She is a progressive through and through, and when she's not the furthest to the left, she is without fail nipping at the heels of her closest rival. I have spent dozens and dozens of hours watching her speak, reading her plans, and thinking through what it would mean to live in Elizabeth Warren's America. Her thinking is defined by her intimate understanding of how our government operates, an understanding she puts to work in imagining how we can fundamentally change its structure. And anyone who tells you it wouldn't be a radically more just and more progressive place is just wrong. She is the candidate for our moment. She's the right one. If you're voting based on education, intersectional social justice, or a simple belief that our biggest and most ambitious proposals are exactly those which need the most care and detail, then Elizabeth Warren's your candidate. Full stop.